So tonight's conversation is going to be about decisions. So when I asked this first question about the first decision she made, let me introduce you to Heather Terrell.
Hi.
So I want to talk first of all about the decision to use a pen name, particularly for this amazing book that you're all going to buy when you're finished.
Of course, right? Well, I will definitely answer that question, but I just wanted to say thank you all for coming out tonight. I mean, this is my first time to Traverse City, and it's my first time to this incredible institution of the National Writers Series, and I just feel so fortunate to be here and to be part of this amazing experience, so thank you. So yes, I am Heather Terrell, and I'm also Marie Benedict, and my real name, but don't tell anybody, because I'll obviously have to kill you afterwards, is Heather Marie Benedict Terrell. So I was, as I think Doug mentioned, I was a lawyer for a long, long time, and I think I mentioned backstage, it was over 10 years, but that's dog years, so that's like 70 years, maybe more. I'm not sure how to calculate that. But anyway, math is not my strong suit. It was a really long time, and when I first started writing, I wrote 7 books under the name Heather Terrell. They explored the themes that still kind of inhabit me today, themes about history and hidden voices within history, but they didn't focus in specifically on women, and they didn't focus in specifically on the genre of historical fiction, using that very intimate I voice, bringing that story really intimately forward. And when I started with the first in the thematically connected series of books, starting with The Other Einstein, and then Carnegie's Maid, and The Only Woman in the Room, it was requested or suggested or inquired as to whether or not I had any interest in using a pen name, and because it really signaled a change in genre, a change in my focus. And I couldn't really answer to like Isabella, because that's a beautiful name, but it has nothing to do with me. So I kind of went with something that was very specific to me, and I became Marie Benedict. But you guys can call me whatever you want, really. Heather, Marie, I answered anything.
Well, I love the name Marie Benedict, and it fit with this book. So I want to talk about, now we're talking an art history and history major in Boston, of all places. Love Boston.
Me too.
I never see you as a Bostonian now that we've gotten to know each other. I don't know what that means, except you just don't look Bostonian.
Okay, I'll take it.
But I want you to talk a little bit more about a sea change, because for women, you know, I just did that. I so appreciate Doug mentioning my new job.
Huge change.
You talk about dog years. When you're a journalist, it's like German Shepherd years. But to leave a newsroom and to go and do something else is really stirring. So when you know, he used the word litigator. So
Right.
you were a real, like, attorney. You were somebody who was actually doing God's work, and then decided...
I wouldn't call it God's work.
Well,
Just
you got to call it
FYI.
something.
Possibly the devil's.
Weren't you
I
praying to
don't
God all
know.
the time while this
I
was
wouldn't
going
call
on?
that.
But so that's a big jump. I want you to go back to the moment that you decided, okay, I've had enough of the law, or I've done what I can accomplish in the law, and I'm going to do something totally different.
Totally different. Well, wow. How long do we have today here, guys? You guys want to be here for about 6 or 7 hours. I'm going to connect 2 seemingly disparate events, right? And it's between those 2 disparate events that the metamorphosis occurred. So I had, and there'll be some wonderful students I spoke with today who have heard a little bit of this, but I had a wonderful aunt who was an English professor growing up, and she gave me a book that was the first pivotal event. She gave me this book, The Mists of Avalon. Has anyone here read it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got applause. That's pretty sweet. So for those of you who don't know it, it is for its time, it was groundbreaking. It's a female-centric retelling of the Arthurian legends. King, Arthur, Lancelot, Knights of the Round Table, but from the perspective of the women. And this was when I was in middle school, and it was really not done at that time, these type of stories. And it opened up my eyes to really the idea that there are so many hidden voices in the past, so many untold stories out there for me to discover. And it started me on the path of becoming what I thought was going to be a historian. That was my major. And if you were a history major, when I was a history major, everyone asked you when you were going to law school, So I ended up going on that path and kind of got deterred by those societal voices kind of pushing me in that direction. And it took me a while, but I knew that wasn't what I was called to do. And a dear friend of mine asked me a question. She asked when I was practicing law. She said, would there ever be a client I would refuse to represent on moral grounds, even though my client had a strong legal position? And I didn't have an answer to that question, but in the days that followed, the very first few cases in which families of Holocaust victims were seeking the recovery of artwork stolen from their families from museums and collectors and art auction houses started to surface. And as I delved into those cases, I realized I had an answer to my friend's question. If I had been asked to be involved in one of those cases, I would be representing the museum. I represented big clients. And I would be advocating against the family of Holocaust victims, and the law would be in my favor. But morally, I couldn't do it. And that moment kind of set me back to where I started, back with the Mists of Avalon, back when I was in middle school, because I realized I had a story. I'd never thought I would be a writer. I was just a reader and a lover of history. I knew in that moment that I had to excavate that story from the past and give voice to that little piece of history, which at that time really hadn't been told. And that was my very first book, The Chrysalis.
Wow.
Was that too long? I'm really sorry.
Not
that
at
was
all.
long-winded.
Not at all.
I go on.
So here's the other decision that one has to make, particularly when you're a historian and you are digging, like reporters do, to find facts. When I got your book, I had not been as excited about a book since Ahab's Wife. Except
Ooh.
Ahab's Wife is like Mists of Avalon, where it's the other person that you don't get to know. Ahab's Wife is about the woman who was left on the shore. Well, you know the Moby Dick story. So this was not that, because what you're doing is taking a real character, Hedy Lamarr, and I'm sad to say I'm old enough to remember as a child seeing those old movies. You know, I watched the Bob Hope, Bing Crosby movies, and we used to have a projector that you could rent from the library in my little hometown, so I could watch The Gay Divorcee on the film reel. Who remembers film reels?
I do.
Please raise your hand. Okay, there we go.
Get your hands up, people.
But I was a kid who used to go to the library and rent that projector and watch all of the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies on the reel. So this was so different for me because this is a real person that you have fictionalized. I want you to talk about the decision to take this woman, Hedy Lamarr, whose story is so amazing, and give her voice. As soon as I started reading it, it was in first person. I was like, how does she know Hedy Lamarr? She's dead. And I went, oh, wait, that's not it.
Yeah.
Why first person and why fictionalized?
Why fictionalized? Well, those are two slightly different but related questions.
Both, right, two questions at once.
I think, first of all, the decision to write in the first person, I can't answer that other than saying it's the only way I can really get into their headspace, my characters, the women that I write about. My research process is pretty elaborate, like Doug mentioned, it's a deep dive. And if I can get my hands on original source material, written letters, journals, written in that I feel like I found my character. And with almost every woman that I've written about, I've been able to make that connection and had some sort of original source material in which they spoke in that voice. And for me to feel that kind of connection and that kind of intimate look into their lives, I think of them as I. When I write them as she, suddenly they're removed from me, and suddenly I don't feel that kind of union with them and that ability to tell their stories.
So you're becoming that woman.
I'm channeling, actually, yes. No, really not. I mean, I'm obviously not Hedy Lamarr, though I wish I was. And to answer your question about...
Well, before you go to that question, because you have been channeling, almost, and because you are gorgeous, regardless of what you think,
right.
I want you to read just a little bit. There were several passages that brought me to tears, but there were some powerful chapters. And whose phone is that?
You know what? We're going to learn tonight that Hedy is responsible for Wi-Fi, and I feel like that's her calling, telling you to turn off your cell phone.
Hedy, we're on it.
All right? Really, I don't care.
I want you to read a passage now that you've talked about her voice so that people can hear her voice through you.
I will do this, but I will say that Rochelle has picked out the one with the most foreign words. So just pretend like I know how to pronounce these. Okay. The sole aspect of the wedding planning in which I involved myself was the guest list. Fritz insisted on inviting not only high society, such as Prince Gustav of Denmark, but also key political leaders, including Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss and Kurt von Schuschnigg. See what I said? I mean, really. My requests were few. I only wanted to include 5 or 6 theater friends of my own and some of Papa and Mama's families, but Fritz had balked. He was worried about the numbers. Fritz had decided upon the Grand Hotel of Vienna on Kirtner Ring for the wedding luncheon, and it would only accommodate 200 people. With Fritz's guests alone, we were nearing that number. As we walked, I asked about an invitation for my theater mentor, Max Reinhardt, an important director and producer in his own right, when Fritz interrupted me with a non sequitur. What do you think of the Karlskirche? Are you familiar with it? Why was he asking me about one of the most famous buildings in Vienna, the fantastical Baroque church with its vast copper cupola flanked by 2 columns? What on earth did it have to do with my request to add Max to the guest list? Was it larger than some of the other venues he was considering? And anyway, it was a Christian church. Of course, Fritz. I worked hard to keep the annoyance out of my voice in the hopes that he'd expand our guest list. No one could live in Vienna and be unfamiliar with the Karlskirche. It dominates our skyline. I shook my head a little and then, after a brief pause, continued discussing the guest list. Are you sure we don't have space for Max? And what about my aunt and uncle? Papa would be so disappointed not to have his brother at the wedding. Hedy, I didn't ask you about the Karlskirche as a way of making general conversation. I wondered whether you would like to get married there, he snapped. Me? Married in the Karlskirche? Was it possible that Fritz didn't know that my family heritage was Jewish? We'd never discussed religion, not his or mine. Not once. I just assumed, as Papa had pointed out, because I hailed from Dobling, he would know. I'm not a Christian, Fritz, I said carefully, and even though I'm not religious, my family background is Jewish. His expression didn't change. I surmised that, Hedy. But that shouldn't stop us from marrying in the Karlskirche. My own father converted from Judaism to Catholicism simply so he could marry my mother. I can arrange for a quick conversion for you so we can be married there. He made the suggestion lightly, as if switching from Jewish to Christian was a matter as easy and uncontroversial as changing a dinner order from fish to beef. I had never heard him speak about his own family's religious history, and I was surprised to hear that he had Jewish ancestry as well. Conversion? My family wasn't religious, but conversion was a drastic step. What would Papa say? I knew how scared he was for me and our family in the anti-Semitic political climate, and how badly he wanted this marriage to proceed as a means of protection. But would that condone this measure? Perhaps we could reach an accord without the necessity for conversion. I chose my words with care. Is there no other place that you'd like us to marry? One of your homes? What about Schloss Schwarzenau or your apartment in Vienna? His eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched in a way I'd only ever seen when he spoke to those nameless business acquaintances who paid their respects at restaurants or when I mentioned his upbringing. The Karlskirche is the place where society folk marry, and I intend to have our wedding celebrated properly. Besides, it won't do for me to have a Jewish wife, not with the sort of business I'll be conducting in the months to come. He nodded, as if reaching a conclusion. Yes, the more I think about it, the more certain I am that we should have a Christian ceremony at the Karlskirche. I slowed my gait. Papa wanted the security that this marriage could provide, and now the marriage required conversion. What other path could I take without putting my family or myself at risk? Besides, I told myself, my tie to religious heritage was tenuous at best. My Jewishness had always been the vaguest of shadows, and a conversion wouldn't preclude acknowledgement of that. I was too far down this road to veer off it now. Giving Fritz's arm a squeeze, I quickened my step to match his stride. Trying to keep my voice light and merry, I said, "Of course, the Karlskirche it is."
Wow. So I read that passage and I was transported to the 1930s, which would have been very different for me. But also thinking about a woman who's one of the smartest women, period. And that is literally what life is like, even when it's a woman of means who's marrying a very wealthy, very horrible man. And so the other decision that I wanted to ask about was how did you decide to make sure people understood that there was strength underneath her while she was also doing something as simple as bowing to the every wish of a monster?
Right. I mean, that's a great question. I think writing in that first person and giving her internal dialogue as well as her external dialogue allows the readers in on Hedy's little secret, that you can be beautiful and brilliant, even though her times didn't believe that, and that was one of the greatest impediments of her life. She described her beauty as a mask she could never take off, a mask she could not remove. And even when she tried to show people a glimmer of what kind of lay beneath that mask, nobody wanted to see it. They wanted her to put that mask back on. So the best way for me to really show the reader all that brilliance and all that doubt and all that strength that really is just bubbling to the surface, but she has to suppress because her time simply won't allow it, is to show you what she's thinking. And that is one of the reasons why I love historical fiction as opposed to nonfiction. It really allows me the opportunity to go places that you can't go in nonfiction, especially in character studies like this. I can hopefully kind of give the reader a window into what she may have been thinking, what she may have been considering or plotting or planning, or, the real truth beneath the acquiescence that you see in her actions.
Now, I can tell you that had I been someone who had some greater sense of history and tried to do something like this as a reporter, we're looking for the lead. We're looking for the headlines. Like, oh my God, Hedy Lamarr, Wi-Fi, GPS. That would have been the story. Your decision was to introduce her to people as a woman, as someone who had to go through all the things she did. And oh, by the way, she also was brilliant and did these things. Can you talk a little bit about the decision you made for the book to be what it was, but how you introduced that she also had a chance to partner on these amazing things that we use every day?
Right. I mean, I think for me, whether it's this particular book about Hedy Lamarr or in the other Einstein, the story of Albert Einstein's first wife, who was also a physicist and kind of explores the idea that she may have played a real role in his theories, I kind of see the characters, my women who were real women, I see them as heroes, and their superpower, for lack of a better word, is really that contribution, that whether it's in Hedy's case, this incredible invention. In the case of Marie Benedict Einstein, it was the theory of relativity. It's really this epiphanal moment, this enormous contribution that they make. And I'm interested in their origin story, almost like they're superheroes. I want to know how they got there, what events led up to that moment, that critical moment in which this woman has made something or contributed something, the legacy of which we are all benefiting from today, but we're unaware of their contribution. So in order to get to that moment, I kind of look backwards and say, when did it start? When was the beginning of the path that put Hedy Lamarr in this unique position of creating this amazing invention, which definitely didn't have the purpose of powering your cell phone over there, or anybody else who wants to have their phone ring. That wasn't her purpose. Her purpose was really to create a secret communication system that would fight the Nazis. And then it took so many iterations after that to ultimately become Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But what happened to her that led to that moment, that led to that epiphanal moment? And that's kind of where the story begins. I look for that start.
That's the thing that drew me and reminded me of Hidden Figures and Katherine Johnson, who literally went to work for, well, not initially with NASA, but for aeronautical folks because she needed a job. She literally was working at a time where she was one of the smartest people in the state of Virginia, but needed a job. And then she wound up being somebody who literally, Neil Armstrong wanted her permission for him to decide, okay, she has to make sure that this orbit is going to work. So that part was so lovely and just meticulously drawn in the book, so that it wasn't a science book and it wasn't totally sort of a literary biography. It was both. So that leads to the next decision. when you are writing about women who have horrible men in their lives and who also have men who are not so horrible, sometimes just stupid,
Right. Or a product of their time.
or a product of their times, how do you decide how much of the characters who aren't your main character are a part of the book? Because when it's someone as horrible as Fritz, I mean, you have to make sure that the reader knows
Right.
who they are, and you have to put enough in there so that they can actually, abhor them. But how do you make the decision? Does that sound too harsh?
No, you need to know that, right? Yeah.
So how do you make the decision about the supplemental characters so that she is still the star? Because she was a star anyway, and we're going
She
to talk a
was.
little bit about, okay, how many people know the story of Hedy Lamarr anyway, even before the book? I know there are people who, come on, you can clap. I mean, Hedy Lamarr, who doesn't want to be, did you notice how I immediately did Hedy Lamarr?
I know. We're not going to talk about that.
I won't say anything else about that. But how do you decide how to make sure that she remains the star while you're trying to make sure people, because it's such a brilliant thing that everybody can't do. Talk about the supplemental characters.
Well, certainly in Hedy's case, the fact of her marriage to Fritz Mandl, for those of you who don't know, at the beginning of the book, she starts out with a really potentially successful fledgling acting career, and she is pursued by Fritz Mandl, who at the time is the richest man in Austria. He derives his wealth from munitions manufacturing, and the political climate being what it is, post-World War I, you have Austria at the center of all these fascist regimes on the rise, Mussolini to the south, Nazi Germany to the north. He's desperate. He's working with politicians to maintain Austria's independence, but ultimately becomes an arms dealer to Mussolini and Hitler, right? And she is in the path of this monstrous person, not just because of his nickname, the Merchant of Death, because he deals in arms, but because he's an abuser, verbal, physical, he's controlling, but the intersection of their paths is absolutely critical for her privy to all the information that led to World War II. All the secret plans that Hitler and Mussolini had, whether it was military or in the case of the Holocaust, and also all her knowledge about weapon system, because those secrets are what she utilized to make the secret communication system that ultimately became Wi-Fi, right? So it's critical to really explore that relationship. But as you mentioned, to really maintain her strength and her independence amidst that. And the way that I chose to do it in this case was to show enough of his monstrosity, but also to show his allure, right? I mean, he wasn't a monster when she married him, or at least as far as she thought. He became a monster in stages as his true nature was revealed in a situation in which the political dynamic is becoming heightened, and his stress and his nerves and his fears are becoming heightened as well. So it happens in stages, not all at once, which is sort of one way to show how she maintains her strength. And then as his abuse and control reaches a fever pitch, her escape necessarily occurs at that point. But there's certainly a lot of anecdotes and stories that I had heard, that I had read, that I chose not to include because I felt as though it would tip the balance against, it would make her so unsympathetic, him so overpowering, and her desire to stay in the situation, even though she often didn't have a choice, would make her not as sympathetic as a character. So there is a fine line you walk in making those choices. And I made those same decisions in The Other Einstein as well. How much of Albert Einstein's very unpleasant treatment of his first wife, Mileva, should I show, despite the fact that I had heard many, many anecdotes beyond what I included in the story. So it's enough to show the really horrific situation in which they'd been living, but not too much.
So next decision is this path that you've created where you now have this series of books. Marie Benedict has this series of books.
And Heather?
And Heather.
I don't know.
Heather Marie Benedict
There we
Terrell.
go. We'll go with that.
where you're letting people know about all of these. Every time you mention the other Einstein, I think about The Wife and how Glenn Close was robbed of an Oscar.
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Yes.
If you want to applaud for that, you may.
Yes, she was robbed.
She was. That's a phenomenal.
And for anybody who didn't see the movie, she was the
Please
wife
watch
of this
it.
amazing writer who wasn't an amazing writer because she was doing all the writing.
Right.
And he won a Nobel Prize.
Anyway.
But you have started something that's an amazing all your own genre of books where you're doing this for these women, where you are literally reintroducing them to the world. Even if it's historically fictionalized, it's still history, and there are still these people. How did you decide to do that? What made you decide to do that?
Well, I mean, there certainly were times as I was jumping into each one of these projects that I almost didn't do it because of the nature of the people who were involved. You know, the first one in the series, of course, is The Other Einstein, and I almost didn't write that book because, you know, Albert Einstein is such an iconic figure, and people are so wedded to this very specific notion of the wild-haired genius, benevolent, which is not who he was. He was a great scientist, but he was not a great man, at least in my opinion. And so I almost didn't do that, you know. And what I tried, at least in that book, and it's a little different here, was I felt strong enough about telling her story. I felt that her life, you know, she made this meteoric rise from the backwater of 19th century Serbia to become one of the very first women to be a physics student at a university. Her story deserved to be told, right? So I decided that I would take that plunge despite the way people might feel about him. And with Hedy Lamarr, it was similar, even though there, you know, in her case, people have certain preconceptions about who she was and who, whether it was in her romantic relationships or who she portrayed on screen. I felt, again, so strongly about people learning the truth, my version of the truth, right, my fictional story, learning this other part of who she was, which in many ways was a legacy far more important than the movies, for when she was once much more famous. I really felt that I should overcome my hesitation to write stories about women and other characters who were otherwise very well known. You know, I really feel, you know, if I do my job right at the end of the day, and people read these stories, which I'm so thankful that they do, then hopefully they'll have sort of a fresh lens with which not just to look at our past, but also our present, you know, to see these women that are really hiding in plain sight all around us, these devices we use, these contributions they've made, these movements that they've started that we have absolutely no idea are really attributable to all these historical women. So if I do my job right, we can start to see them and not just rewrite them back into books, but actually see them in the world that we inhabit. And then we won't not see them in the future, right? It's almost like we have to relearn and put on these fresh lenses to actually see them where they already are. So if I do my job right, then I take the risk about writing about these women, then it's worth that discomfort that I feel sometimes.
Well, you did your job right. And I do like the idea of a fresh lens because we can all use those every now and again.
Oh my gosh, me too.
So anyway, I was watching Jurassic Park last week.
A non sequitur, sorry.
For the 5th time. Maybe the 15th over time, but the 5th
Right.
time just recently in the past year. And there's a beginning sequence in this very popular Steven Spielberg movie where they're explaining how they were able to create a dinosaur. And it's because they get the dino DNA and then they have to fill in these gaps. So I want you to talk about the decision about which things had to be historically accurate and which things you took a little liberty with because you needed it for the tale, and how you decide which is which.
Well, I'm going to digress just for a quick minute,
Please.
just to talk just for a second, not too much, I don't want to bore you, just about how I do the research, what the process
Yes,
looks
let's
like
do that,
a little
because I was
bit.
going to ask about archival first, but then I got excited about Jurassic Park.
Well,
So-
I understand.
So
And
let's
the
do
analogy
archival
is
first.
clear. The analogy is clear. I think, you know, for me, the research, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, starts really with that original source material, if I can find it. The hurdle that you always face in writing about historical women is that it's only recently that women's stories and women's documents and their research has been considered worthy of keeping. So when you're going back into the past and you're looking for documents that you might otherwise assume would be available for someone of that time period and class and aren't necessarily available for women. So let's put that on the side, because that really plays into that line between fact and fiction. So when I can get my hands on original source material, which are things written at the time in the person's hand or by a contemporary, that's like the gold standard. That's what I want, right? I want to find things that will help me really inhabit that character's voice and mind and perception, and really give me wonderful insights. And then I'm going to layer in the rest of the research. I'm going to look at whatever I can find about the socio-political world, the cultural developments, their clothes, the food that they eat. I've got to not only create a world that really makes sense, that's very realistic, but also to show what is impacting this particular character at this particular time, right? So once I've done all that, I kind of look at it as the architecture of my story. It's the foundation, the pillars, the roof that I'm anchoring my tale. But there's always going to be that little gap where I know what might have happened on an event that happened on a particular date at a particular time, but I don't know the conversation that took place. I don't know what was going through the character's mind, unless she journaled it, in which case I'll definitely include it. So just as an example, I know the date that passage we just read, right? I know the date that Fritz and Hedy got married, and I know where it took place, and I know who was there, and I know what dress she wore, but I don't know the conversation she had with her father as she's about to walk down that aisle, right? I don't know. But based on what I do know, and based on the documents that I've read, and that little tiny remnant of lawyerly logic that remains, I think I can extrapolate and create a scene. And that's really where the fiction comes in. And I hope it allows me to round out the tale in a more fulsome way than I might otherwise have. Now, of course, there's things that I don't know, right? And there are important things that I have to include in the story, but I don't have the answer to the question. And I will never go directly against a historical fact that I've learned, but where there's an opening, where there's uncertainty, is also where fiction might come in. So one example would be in the book, Hedy adopts a young boy, Jamesy, and she calls him Jamesy, and we don't know anything about why she adopted him, and there's so much controversy, even today, over who this child was, why she adopted him, was he really her own child, and I couldn't find an answer. There is no answer, really. And as I was researching adoption at this time to try and get a sense of how unusual it was that she had adopted when she was a young woman in her 20s, I learned about the work of two other historical women, Frances Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor under the president, and Kate Rosenheim, who was the Nazi head of the Children's Welfare Unit. And they were working together to save Jewish children, secretly bringing them into the United States and having them adopted to American families. And I thought this was unbelievable. I never heard of this work. They crossed enemy lines to do it. And this was happening right at the same time that Hedy adopted Jamesy. And I just couldn't help but think to myself, here's a woman, a Jewish refugee herself, riddled with guilt over the fact that she left Austria knowing what was going to happen to the Jewish people and only got herself out. If she was presented with a young child to adopt, wouldn't it be possible that she would take him in? Now, that's total fiction. I have no proof for that ever occurred. But I wanted to highlight the work that these women had did, and it fit my story. And so that was a work completely of fiction, inserted into what I hope is otherwise a relatively realistic historical narrative.
And for me, that works because you've already talked about it being historical fiction. You know that there are parts that are contextually possible, contextually have to have happened. The reporter in me and the editor in me wants to go, no, we have to know. But you don't really have to know everything because you're writing about a woman's heart and about her soul and about this journey rather than a ticker tape. It's not a news article.
No.
So, but do you get any pushback from people who want more? Like, okay, well, if you don't know for sure, then what else can you tell us? Or where's the rest of the story?
Oh, all the time. And I constantly get emails where people have corrected me. Not my favorite thing to get, but it happens. people always want to know what's fact and what's fiction. And it's, to me, the greatest compliment when someone else has gone down the rabbit hole where I live and checked out some of the facts. Please fact check me. I love it because I'm going to learn something new too. But I love, that's such a compliment when someone is intrigued enough by the story that they're going to learn more and they're going to dig deeper. And I usually do include in the back in the author's note a list of nonfiction research material compilations that you can use to do that, which I would definitely recommend over Wikipedia, although Wikipedia does serve its purpose, right? So, I think for me, it's that is a big part of it. That is, but part of it too is just kind of making sure that while I satisfy my own kind of maniacal sense of historical accuracy and research, and that I've unturned every stone, that when I can't, I'm going to fill it in with the most logical explanation that I can come with that still fits the arc of my story.
I think that's fantastic. I love everything about that, which leads me to our next decision. When you finish something like The Other Einstein, or you found a character like that, how do you pick the next character? What drew you to Hedy Lamarr?
Oh, wow. It's such a
Because
hard
you could have
question.
gone, several places, but this particular time for this particular thing,
book.
particularly when we have no privacy and
Right.
the internet is the talk of the town every day. And
Right. Well, I keep it's like a Santa Claus list of women that I would love to write about. As I mentioned, I find them everywhere. They're everywhere. And people always come to me with their own ideas too, which I love. And I've often considered a lot of those. So when I was writing The Other Einstein, or when I was finishing up Carnegie's Maid, I had on my list a woman that a dear friend of mine who's an anthropologist had mentioned. She had mentioned this golden age of Hollywood actress who had made an invention, right? And I had put her on my list, and I kind of was, this is what I do, as I kind of am finishing up a book, I'm circling back to the next idea, thinking about what I want to write next. And when I kind of dug into Hedy's story, and I learned that invention that my friend had mentioned wasn't just revolutionary, which it was. I mean, it's hard to overestimate how innovative her secret communication system was. This innovation she was going to superimpose on torpedo systems to make them radio controlled, which nobody had been able to figure out how to do. Nobody except Hedy Lamarr.
girl power.
Woo! I mean, if it had been adopted, there's a decent chance it could have really changed the war landscape at sea, but it wasn't. But when I learned, not only was this just incredible, right, that she had made this invention, I learned the legacy of it, and that every day we hold and utilize a piece of her legacy, whether it's on our cell phones or our Bluetooth headphones. Any wireless device we use really stems from that original patent that she created for her secret communication system for torpedoes. I knew that hers was the story I had to tell because it really shows so pointedly how her legacy lives with us every day, and how we have no idea that it's there. It's hard to come up with a more tangible piece of evidence for women's impact and women's unknown impact. So when all of those things kind of coalesced, I knew hers was the story I had to tell next. But there are so many.
Can you imagine if you asked somebody, oh God, who invented the GPS? And I don't know the guy. Or do you know anything about the history of Wi-Fi? And there's like a whole list. It's like, oh, I'll have to look him up. And
Right.
they'd be wrong every time.
Every time. And I love that.
So,
I just to digress for 1 second,
Sure.
too, and it kind of goes to what you're saying about just assuming that it's, like we do, it's a man. Part of me that wanted to write this book as well because of my own reaction to the story when my friend first said, golden age of Hollywood actress, also an inventor. I remember feeling surprised, right, that this beautiful woman could have invented this incredibly groundbreaking device. And I was angry at myself for feeling that way. And I think most people who I tell the story to, they're like, really? She was both brilliant and beautiful? And and here I write women's historical stories, but it's so ingrained in each of us is this reaction, especially when we're looking at historical women whose lives and whose opportunities have been much more conscripted than modern day women. But even still, I was really chastising myself for even thinking that. And I wanted to explore that feeling. I wanted to explore what Hedy must have faced on a regular basis, being so smart, so brilliant, and constantly having to suppress that part of herself because no one could believe that both of those things could coexist. And I thought, that is a historic problem, but even for my reaction to my friend telling me her story that first time, it's a modern day problem too. So, it was definitely in part the invention, but also in part it was my own sort of visceral reaction to that story.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to say that next, literally. I'm not a fan of Hidden Figures. I don't mean just the movie, but just in general, that all of a sudden we are just hearing the stories of these people, but particularly women, who did amazing things and we didn't know. Katherine Johnson is like nearing 100 years old, and I'm like, yeah, we're celebrating her now, but she got no celebration when she was actually doing this. And when I got the book, I was embarrassed. And then I was angry. I said, how did I, because journalists know everything. We absolutely know everything. We must know everything. I said, how did I not know this? Because I knew the name Hedy Lamarr. I knew the actress. I never knew this. I was really embarrassed and then really mad at myself.
And did you struggle at all with that feeling like, how could this be true? Like this sense that this was an incredible story, not incredible in the sense that she rose up and made this unbelievable invention, but that these two things could not coexist together. That we have this instinctive reaction to that.
I love when we switch
I'm
roles
sorry,
and play
I'm just
interviewer
gonna
and
ask her
interviewee.
some questions.
But really, I want to answer that because here was the thing: I didn't even get to that point about the beauty and the brains. I was just mad that this was hidden, that this was not something that people knew in 2019.
Right.
It's bad enough that it just wasn't known, period, and that she had to hide it. But I thought, this should at least be mentioned in a history class, or somebody should have said something about this. That got me. And then, of course, she was beautiful, and then I got just jealous.
Well, there's that.
God, so she does all of this stuff, and she was gorgeous.
She's got it all.
She's got it all.
But what's interesting about what you just said is, one of the greatest things, because writing is such a solitary profession.
Yes.
So for me to come out to get to talk to people and then get their feedback afterwards, I have met all over the country so many people who knew Hedy Lamarr, knew her children, were her caretakers. But I've also had the opportunity to meet so many women in this field who said that Hedy's contribution to Wi-Fi, to all the patent that's at the core of this, has always been known in those circles. The people, they're like, oh, that's Hedy's patent. That's actually how it's referred to in the fields in which this patent is utilized. And when I learned that, and I did a little research, and I realized that was true. What's more frustrating is that there was some awareness of it, and yet it still wasn't brought to the forefront. Not until the very end of Hedy's life. She died in her 80s, and I was told by her caretakers who came to an event I did in Florida, which was such a gift, that in the very end of her life, she started to get a few awards. Not big awards, but some recognition for the role that she had played. And that meant more to her than any movie she'd ever participated in. And I just, to hear that, to learn that she did have some sense of the recognition that she could receive for that was really, really amazing to hear. So I felt very fortunate that they came.
Oh, I got chills with that.
Yeah.
You mentioned Jamesy, so what I'd like to do is end our portion of this wonderful evening by having you read something that moved me to tears. Because as women, well, not for me because I'm not a wife, although I'm still looking, but when we have to juggle all of those things we do as mothers, as wives, and then as whatever it was we were meant to be in addition to those things, nobody else knows what that's like. And there's a passage in the book that I'd like for our audience to hear you read because I think it's the perfect place for us to end.
Thank you.
Here you are.
The chance to adopt the refugee child wasn't one Jean had jumped at. No, if I were truthful with myself, had I. I'd felt compelled to pick up that piece of paper off the table at the Brown Derby. My compulsion stemmed not out of maternal longing. My own upbringing was bereft of warm motherly role models, but stemmed from a sense of guilt and my subsequent inaction. Perhaps, I thought to myself, if I saved this child, it would serve as penance for all the others I didn't save. I'd never explained to Jean about Jamesy's likely heritage or the circumstances behind his adoption, but then he had no idea about my own Jewishness either. Would the truth have made him feel more connected to me, more attached to Jamesy? What did Jean understand about the adoption was that it was a possible means of knitting us together. His very willingness to move forward with the adoption for me, even when he already had a daughter of his own, made me feel closer to him. And when I held Jamesy in my arms, I gazed at Jean with a sense of completeness. But when bringing a baby into our home didn't yield the close family unit for which I'd hoped, but instead the usual two separate lives, the reality of our alienation became inescapable. I read Jean's words. I heartened a little at the list of qualities he admired: my European charm, my beauty, my skills as a homemaker and mother, and my intellect. Glancing up at Jean, I gave him a small smile that he didn't see. He was lost in my words. Then I braced myself for the list of my flaws that surely he must have written. But the list was blank. My brows knitted, and I looked up from the page into Jean's waiting eyes. "You didn't list any problems," I mentioned. "No," he said. "Why?" "Because they're not your problems, Hedy. They're not your flaws. The problem between us lies with me." "What do you mean?" Jean's eyes grew soft, almost sad. "You married me hoping for something entirely reasonable, Hedy. A husband, a home, a family. But what you want, I can't give to you. I don't have it in me to be parent to another child. Not now, anyway." I nodded, understanding at last. This marriage to Jean would never improve, never progress. It was over. Jean braved the silence, saying what both of us thought, but neither wanted to say first. "Shall we meet with a lawyer?" I nodded. There was really no other way. "What about Jamesy?" Jean asked, tilting his head toward the sleeping baby. What was he asking? Was he asking who would get custody? Or was he asking the unthinkable, whether we would return him? I lifted my son from the bassinet and squeezed him close. Jamesy squealed a little, but didn't waken. "I will keep him," I said, knowing that Mrs. Burton, Jamesy's nanny, would spend far more time with him than me because of my work demands. Still, I supposed, his life in America was far better than the fate that he left behind in Europe. Jean nodded, reaching out to touch my free hand gently. "I'd still like to see him from time to time." "Of course, Jean. You're his father, after all. Whatever role you'd like to play." I'd clung to Jean as a safe haven, a version of Papa that he couldn't possibly fulfill, and he'd married the glamorous movie star who partied nightly. But I was only simple Hedy Kiesler, and he was a Hollywood bon vivant. I carried a heavy secret for which I needed to atone, and Jean sought the light, shunning even the hint of darkness. We were opposite, and we were strangers.
Wow.
Kind of dark, guys.
No, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Heather Marie Benedict Terrell.
Thank you. Thank you. You are fabulous.
And now it's time for us to get questions from you all. And I know there are lots. I know that you love the book if you read it, and you have things that you want to ask as you go to get it. And there will be microphones in the audience, and I have my glasses on so that I can
ready to
see
rumble.
you. We're ready to rumble. So we're going to look over here and see if I see someone standing right here. Shelley! That's my friend Shelley Levy from Northport with her husband Tom. I'm so glad to see you. Thank you. Hi, Tom. I'm sorry for that commercial break.
Thank you for coming, for Rochelle.
So questions. Right over here. Are you raising your hand? Oh, you were just putting your sweater on. Okay. Oh, we have one right here
in the
in the
middle.
center. Thank you. And even though we're going to hand the mic over, we still want you to let other people come after you.
I just wanted to know your writing process.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's I have an algorithm. No, that's completely untrue. I actually did an event with an author who literally had an algorithm, and I was like, I am in the wrong profession. Something's not right here. My process, I would say, it's a little different for each book, but I do a book a year. So I have about between 12 and I have 12 months, but I take about 10 months. Once we've decided, I do a little bit of research on each of the women in my laundry list before my editor and I decide upon a particular woman. And then for about 10 months, we're together, right? And I spend the first couple of months pretty much exclusively in that deep rabbit hole of research, really making sure I understand the arc of the story, both the original source material, the broader picture, the world building I have to do, even though it is historical. And then I think, was it Kate Atkinson, who's one of my favorite writers? Did anybody read Life After Life? It's one of my favorite books. So in that book, I read an interview she gave, and she said, I do all this research and then I forget it. And it is a little bit like that. It's like I've lost myself in my character and my world, and I start writing. Now, don't get me wrong, there's stacks of research material all over the place that I constantly am referring back to, but I've learned enough to be dangerous, and I can start to write. Definitely, I'm researching always as I go. There's so many details, whether macro or micro, that I need, and things I can't even anticipate. And while I generally have a pretty fixed outline of where my story is going to go, I leave enough latitude for where the research might take me or where the characters might take me, because they can really take you on some really unexpected journeys that you hadn't anticipated when you started out. I mean, Jamesy is a case in point. I didn't know, I could never have anticipated where that research would have taken me. And I'm so glad it did. I mean, that's a really short answer for a really long process, but that's the gist of it.
Who else has a question?
Oh, people, come
on. And while they're making up their minds, I want to ask a follow to that question, because I don't know whether she was asking whether you write day or night, but do you write?
Was it like that? I'm sorry.
Do you write in the mornings, or do you write at night, or are you one of those people who has to write at a particular time every day?
I would not be writing a book a year if that's how I have 2 kids at home. I have to write when they're not home because they're super distracting. I don't know if your children are like that, but so I usually write, I pretty much write from 8:30 to 3:30 when they're in school. And in the summers, it's slightly different. But I've become extremely adept at picking up my computer and writing wherever, whenever. Waiting during a really boring soccer game that's not going well, in my car while I'm waiting for car line pickup, on an airplane. I mean, it does not have to be a perfect place, a perfect time. It can literally be anywhere as long as my children aren't nagging me. There you go. That's probably the number one thing. Actually, I'm writing my book that comes out not this upcoming January. That book is about Clementine Churchill. It's called Lady Clementine. But the book that comes out the year after that, the January after that, which is actually about Agatha Christie and her disappearance. She disappeared for 11 days, and it led to the greatest manhunt in England's history when they tried to find her. And so it's a story about her disappearance and all sorts of other things. But there's a great quote that she said that I discovered recently, and she said, "I can write anywhere where my children aren't."
There you go.
I thought that works. That works. Yes.
There's a question right there.
She's coming to you. I can run down
we'll
there
come
with the
right
mic
to you
too.
next. Okay.
As you make your Santa list or your list of potential women to write about, what are the characteristics you look for? And as you research them and try to decide, what have been surprises in women who you found out that didn't turn out to be as interesting as you thought, that you had to sort of move on from?
What a great question.
That's a great question.
Wow. Oh my, I'm going to feel kind of bad in a minute when I talk about the ones I've discarded. But I am looking for something specific. I mean, there's lots of historical women that have led fascinating lives, but they may not have done something very specific. So I'm looking for a woman who's either grappling with an issue that is historic and also very, very modern, that came up very frequently in the book about Clementine Churchill, because she was really the woman not behind the man, but beside and often in front of the man. And her the recognition she got for her work, the role that she played, that balance of work and family really comes into play. And that's a very modern issue. With other women, they may have made something, like with Hedy, and we are living with that legacy. So there has to be some very modern component to either their life, their struggle, or something that they've created that we are living with every day. Now, there are lots of women who've led fascinating historical lives who have not dealt with something very modern, right? So they would not be someone that I was particularly interested in. But once I do start to narrow it down, and there's a huge number of women who've made significant contributions to our everyday lives, I'm looking for someone who's had a really rich life, right? Somebody who's, and by that I don't mean financial. I mean, they can, Carnegie's maid, the main character in that story, was impoverished. I'm looking for somebody who's really striving for something, somebody who's yearning, somebody who's had a really textured sort of origin story, and whose sort of life is in an arc that kind of leads to that modern issue or modern contribution. And not everybody fits that, right? And I can massage their story to make it fit if I think it's gonna work. But there are many women who just, there wasn't enough there. I mean, one example I can think of off the top of my head is Amelia Earhart had, not her specifically, she's great, but there's way too much written about her. That's the other thing. I definitely am, if there are women whose lives have been explored, like Amelia Earhart, then I feel like maybe I need to turn the spotlight on somebody who hasn't been so fortunate, somebody who hasn't had the chance to have their specific life story explored. So those are kind of the very general things that I'm looking for. But there's incredible women, like Lewis, the Leakey family. Are you familiar with them? They basically discovered that first footstep of early man, and they were a couple, and I really feel like she made a huge amount, undertook a lot of the work, but there's all sorts of issues with that story that just somehow won't make it come forward for me. So that would be an example of a historical woman who really made some incredible contributions, but there's just something about the way her story arcs that isn't going to fit the bill. I mean, I may turn to her at one point, but that's not the one that's at the forefront.
That was a great question. We're going to go upstairs for the next one, and then we'll come back down to you. Yes.
Yes, thank you, by the way, for being here.
Thank you.
You mentioned wanting to try to understand what made Hedy Lamarr a strong person, discovering in her childhood or her family relations or some incident that made her a strong person. What made Hedy Lamarr a strong person?
I think in her case, and this is a pattern I see with a lot of the women I write about, they had to have one person in their life. It could be a parent, it could be another family member. It doesn't have to be a parent. In Hedy's case, it was her father. One person in their life who believed in them unconditionally. Not just unconditional love, but absolute faith that that person was capable of anything. And that is a pattern that I've seen time and time again in all of the women I write about. They had, society is in many ways stacked against them, bucking the norm in any way. There had to be somebody in their life who not only lit the fire, but kept it burning for them and really formed that core belief, starting from when they were very young, that they were capable of doing something very different. Every single woman I write about has that, without exception.
Right there.
Did you read Hedy's autobiography? And if so, did you use any of it in your research?
Okay, I'm just going to throw this right back at you. Have you read that autobiography?
No.
Okay. Has anybody here read Ecstasy, the autobiography?
Wow, there's not one hand.
Thank God, is all I'm going to say. There are two fascinating parts about Hedy's autobiography. One is that it's basically softcore porn. I'm just going to throw that out there. For those of you who are considering reading it, I do not recommend it unless that's your thing, right? The second thing is that it's not a tremendous source of original source material, much as I thought when I first picked it up, when I first ordered it. I thought, oh my God, an autobiography, what could be better, right? It's her own life history in her own words. What can I plunder? Well, she wrote this much later in life, which of course always adds sort of that veneer of time, which you have to take with a grain of salt. But she narrated her story to a ghostwriter. She didn't write it herself. And then she sued the ghostwriter because she claimed that none of it was true. He then produced tapes in which she basically had said everything that was in the autobiography, although it was clear at certain points that she wasn't exactly coherent. So this gives you one snapshot into the problems that I sometimes face in making sure that Hedy herself was a reliable narrator for her story. So, you finally think you're going to stumble across some great piece of research and it's just riddled with problems. And that actually was one of the main problems in terms of research and writing about Hedy. There wasn't a ton of original material. She had to flee Austria with a small bag. Pretty much everything from her neighborhood was decimated in World War II. So what you're relying on are a lot of secondary accounts and interviews that she gave later. So, imagine my delight when I found that autobiography. Right.
We have a question right over here. Yes.
Boy, I'd like to read a story about you. And I don't mean to be facetious, but I really
goodness.
I really like your shoes.
Well, thank you.
There you go.
My-
Let's have
We
a
had
hand for the
conversation
shoes.
about our shoes. We are obviously in a monochromatic. We got a memo, and we were told to wear black and white today, and we did. But we were not going to let that hold us back.
My question is, is the culture of fashion that women have lived through over the ages, has that had anything to do with women's personality and professions?
100%. And what a fabulous question. I haven't had anybody ask that one. Yes. If you couldn't breathe or barely walk, it was very hard to rise up and do something different, right? If your corset was so tight, you could barely get a word out. You were not going to tell your parents, that you were going to medical school, right? Actually, in the book that comes out next, the one about Clementine, I actually have a whole scene about that because, she grew up, her life really spans World War II. The book spans World War I through World War II. And I didn't really understand when I decided to write her story how influential and important Winston was in World War I as well. And you can see the absolute delight she takes when suddenly she doesn't have to wear a corset. And then suddenly the skirts get shorter and they get looser. And that freedom of movement and she, when she was younger, she was a suffragette, and she wore this much more loose-fitting suffragette uniform that was really a statement that these women who wanted these particular rights at a time when they didn't have them, they weren't going to fit the mold that society was trying to hold them to. So, absolutely, women's clothes, their restriction of movement, their freedom of movement, in some ways is very much a mirror and or a gateway to their ability to expand past what society expected of them. And it can work both ways.
That's one of the best questions I've heard
I love that
anywhere.
question.
I think I want to write that book.
That's a whole
because
book right there.
When I celebrated my birthday in January, I decided from that point forward, I would only wear comfortable clothes and everything had to have pockets.
Oh my gosh, why did you not tell me from now on?
All the time.
Yes.
We've got another question
Gotta own
up
it.
top. Hi.
Hi. How has researching and writing about these women in history impacted you as a woman?
Oh my gosh, another fabulous question.
You ladies need to come right down here and pull up chairs. These are
Yes,
great.
right here. Love that. It has, oh my gosh, again, do you have a couple of hours? I mean, two things. I unconsciously select women who are dealing with issues that I'm dealing with, right? And I find myself midway through a book like, oh my God, like this is what I'm dealing with in my own life. And these are not autobiographies, so don't go looking in there for that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, these women, you know, when I think about the other Einstein, my children were younger. She is just beleaguered with young children. She can't get a free headspace to work on her theories. And, you know, those issues are ones that I was dealing with. And in many ways, processing those issues through the lens of history throws them into bold relief and allows me to see them more clearly. And I find that a lot of women, and men, but a lot of women who read my books often will derive things, lessons or images or insights about their own lives that they otherwise didn't really have a firm grasp on in reading about it with that distance, right? And it allows me the opportunity to process it as well. Sometimes I'm surprised as I'm midway through a story that unconsciously I must have chosen. There must have been something about that woman and her struggle that was really attractive to me and where I was at that time in my life. So these are very much exercises for me in my own growth as well.
We've got a question right over here.
Heather Marie, welcome to Traverse City from Michigan Writers. You mentioned earlier working with the students, the Front Street Writers, and
By the way, that awesome question was one of those peeps
bravo,
up there. Yeah,
bravo.
they're awesome. by
Please
the
give
way.
them a hand. These
They
are amazing young
fabulous.
people.
So phenomenal. What a wonderful afternoon I had with them today.
That's great. I'm wondering, for many of us here, we are history buffs. We enjoy hearing the stories in our families. And in talking to the students, how did you today turn them on to historical research and the value of history to today in their lives?
Did I turn them on to that? Was that a yes, guys? Okay, I got some thumbs up there. I'm going to go with a yeah. I hope I pretty much saying what I just said. I think, you know, in understanding that history is not something that's over. You know, the reverberations of history live in and among us and through us today. We live with the legacy. I mean, the cell phone is obvious, a very clear reminder of that history. Most reverberations are invisible. And ultimately, my goal is to have people start to identify them as well. And whether those are reverberations on a massive scale, you know, like dealing with, like Rochelle has, the legacy of slavery and how we have to face that and we have to process that. And that affects us in ways that we don't even talk about or know. It's very unconscious. Or whether it's something smaller, whether it's something that has happened in our own families that we go back and say, well, the abuse that my grandfather suffered at the hands of my great-grandfather then affected all these generations of people, and I live with that legacy every day today. People need to, I believe, this is just my own opinion, but I believe people need to look at the reverberations of the past, not just from a big picture, which we do still need to do very much, but also in our own families to understand why we are the way we are and how we do the things we do and why we make the choices we make. Because so much of that is unconsciously driven, but unless we do that work and make that analysis, and I hope that they see that too. I hope that they can see that history isn't something that's in a textbook. It's not something that's past. It's something that's very much present.
We're going to go back upstairs, and thank you for saying that. I so appreciate. I mean, we all bring ourselves into everything we do, but thank you so much for it. That was a great question, too.
Great question.
You guys are great. We're going to go up top for one more upstairs.
Hi.
Oh, one of our students.
Yeah.
Yay.
You're great.
During the editing process of The Only Woman in the Room, was there anything that you cut out of the book that you wish you'd kept in?
Ooh.
You really do want me to tell my secrets today.
I
First,
do.
your colleague wanted me to tell what I'm processing, all these dark things. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I definitely am more of a spare writer, right? I am, we talked a little bit in our talk this afternoon about what details I choose to include and not, and how you don't overburden the narrative with historical details, or if you're writing fantasy, that kind of world building that you do. And it is a fine line. I'm always, I am learning very often about a time period in a new way as I write a book. So for example, with The Only Woman in the Room, I had to learn Austrian history from the perspective of an Austrian Jew in the 1930s. I learned so much more than I had ever been taught in any of my history classes because I had to understand it from her perspective. Now, when I did that, did I maybe add a little too much? Did I go overboard in my knowledge of Austrian political history? Absolutely. And my editor was going to give that a great big X. In other areas, I had, like, for example, another thing that I learned that I was encouraged to write more rather than less was I had to learn about America's immigration policies during World War II, which were really shameful. I mean, the way our immigration policies were written, we basically excluded thousands of Jewish refugees that could have been saved if they came to our country. We were very exclusionary at that time. And that was a very important part of the story. And I was encouraged to include more of that. So for me, I'm probably, because I am spare in my writing, I really try so hard not to, my editor calls it like an information dump. She doesn't want me to just like, okay, I know that you learned that, but not everybody else needs to know that. I'm so overcautious of doing that. I probably err on the other side, but I am guilty of that from time to time for sure. And those are the kind of things that I have to pare back and make sure I don't kill the narrative and the flow of the story by sharing with you all the fascinating details that I've learned about Austrian political history in the 1930s. Fascinating though that may be.
We've got time for one more question, and we're going to go right over here.
So what are the ages and genders of your children, and how has the research and writing that you've done influenced your parenting of them?
Oh my gosh, you guys are getting right to the core of it today. I love it. Okay, so I have two boys, 10 and 13, and wow, I mean, what I write influences my parenting in so many ways. First of all, I realize, I mean, if you live in my house and you are my children, you really have to love history. It's like not optional to not love history. And fortunately, they do love history. I mean, that's not their true passion like it is mine, but they do love it. And what it's made me so careful of doing is making sure I'm so inclusive not just of women, that is, and my focus in part, but inclusive of all voices, and making sure that when they are doing a school assignment, or we're traveling and we're learning a piece of history, or when we are talking about the news, or that they are understanding that there are so many other voices, and that the voice we hear on television, or that the story they're reading on the internet, or even the novel that they're reading, that's only one voice. And that isn't necessarily the authority on that topic, and that you need to make sure that you do the investigation to suss out and get all of those voices to make your own decision about something. And so that's really, in terms of what I write and how that's impacted my parenting, that's probably the most impactful thing. And I knew I was doing my job right. The other day, we have, unfortunately, an enormous billboard of Albert Einstein that I have to pass all the time. And, it's one of those pass it forward. Have you guys seen those? Do you have those? All right. When my younger son, who's 10, looked up, Albert, where's Maleva's billboard, Mom? And I was like, I did something right with this one. And my other son, who's like a budding astrophysicist, came home the other day with a book he wanted me to write about, I'm not even sure I can get it, Vera Rubin. Do you guys know who she is? She's a famous scientist, and he felt that her contributions had not been acknowledged, and that she would make a really good topic. I thought, all right, because, it isn't just the girls who need to have their lenses changed. It's the boys, too. It's everybody that needs to have a fresh lens.
Well, you can't beat that. You're not just writing about past generations, but you're also influencing new generations. Your sons sound great. I want to thank the National Writer Series for doing this amazing work. Thank them for having me back for a second year in a row to have two amazing experiences. And ladies and gentlemen, Marie Benedict.
Thank you, and thank you to Rochelle
The only woman in the room.
Wow, how lucky am I? Thank you.